here we go again. You know McDonald's, right?
Yeah, everyone on Earth knows McDonald's.
But why? What's so special about McDonald's that led them to end up covering so much of the planet?
I'm not going to get into a whole bunch of the specifics about the food or their relentless marketing to generations of children, because as messed up as that stuff is, that's not what we do on this show. There's plenty of places to find information about how bad McDonald's is.
What I want to talk about is franchising.
Franchising is the thing that McDonald's perfected that led them to be such a massive brand.
A franchise is an individual unit of a business that is owned by an outside entity or individual, but it plays by all the rules laid down by that corporation. Most McDonald's locations you've ever been to were franchises, but they all still have the golden arches, they also have the same basic menu, the ice cream machine's probably down.
You know, McDonald's stuff.
When McDonald's was in its early stages of expansion, they were a centrally managed business. And that means each new location was a corporate-owned and managed store, and that meant that the firm had to hire the new managers for each store, they had to manage those managers, and that meant they had to maintain a larger and larger corporate bureaucracy the more stores that they added.
By moving to the franchise model, they dramatically reduced the amount of bureaucracy that they needed to add each additional franchise.
And that's because a franchisee is deeply invested in the success of their share of that business.
Before the franchise even exists, the prospective franchisee takes data from corporate to look for potential holes in the market, and does some of the market research on their own to choose the right location for the new store.
They do a lot of legwork to secure the new site that the store will be built on, and they oversee the construction of the building.
The franchisee is not just a salaried employee who has no incentive beyond continuing to collect their check. They get profit sharing, and they own a share of that business, so if they decide to sell later, they can sell at a profit if the store is more valuable.
And they also lose some of their own money if the store goes under.
If you're a business and you want to expand quickly and widely, you need franchisees on the front line who are invested in your success.
And by doing all this, by franchising, the centrally owned part of the firm is taking a trade-off. They get less of the profit per store than they would get to keep if they held everything under direct ownership. But they also get back the most aggressive expansion model possible.
And the amount that the central firm gets in total from franchise fees and the profits they make selling proprietary supplies to their franchises is exponentially more than they would ever make operating fewer centrally managed stores where they get to keep 100% of the profit. 100% of the profit from 100 stores is way less than 50% of the profit from 100,000 stores.
If this is all making sense to you, then congratulations, you understand neo-imperialism and its comatose nephew, crypto-imperialism.
Told you we'd talk about this later.
The biggest difference between these modern forms of imperialism and corporate franchising is that corporate franchising is an expansionary tactic first and foremost. But for most of the empires aside from the US itself, the franchise model has been used to decolonize without actually giving anything up.
Forms of imperialism fall within a spectrum. There aren't really pure forms of one type or the other type, but we can see certain ideas about what constitutes effective imperialist policies developing and dominating at different points in time.
Neo-imperialism crept up over several decades, and you could argue that in some very early stages of imperialism involving the British and the Dutch East India companies, those systems had a lot more of the hallmarks of neo-imperialism in their DNA than their contemporaries, especially when it comes to private corporations being in the dominant position rather than governments.
But neo-imperialism really hit its zenith under US President Woodrow Wilson. The part of the recipe Wilson is most responsible for is this franchise-like element of neo-imperialism, pawning off the key responsibilities of organization and control by brute force onto local governments, and using a combination of bribery and subterfuge to keep those regimes in line.
Wilson figured out that for the US to occupy Haiti or the Dominican Republic or Honduras indefinitely to allow American corporations to extract the natural resources of those countries and the labor of the local populations would be very expensive and very unpopular.
It would put US troops in protracted conflict with rebels and cost lives as well as money.
Not to mention the bad publicity in the US press that could come from it.
So Wilson's strategy was to sell franchises of the American empire. Rather than trying to set up a colonial-style government in the places where he wanted control, mostly Latin America and the Caribbean, he simply went in with the Navy and the Marines under the guise of peacekeeping, knocked out the local autonomous government, and replaced it with a hand-picked client state, who could be bought off with some of the proceeds from plundering the country.
By enriching a small segment of the local population through bribery, and supplying them with arms and military advisors to modernize and professionalize their armies, these new colonies could be held in place with very minimal resources on the part of the imperial power, not to mention attract a lot less attention.
This also paired well with the transition that had been slowly occurring through the modern imperial era, a transition from the land-based power of monarchies to the capital-based power of modern corporations.
Entities like the British and Dutch East India Companies had been around for centuries by this point, but it was around this time where corporations had supplanted the old feudal power structure and replaced it with the modern capitalist one.
So when the US amplified its aggression towards its Latin American neighbors following the victory in the Spanish-American War, the guiding force of its operations across the region was the interests of the fruit and sugar companies most of all.
This new franchise-style model was very beneficial for the corporations involved. It gave them authoritarian regimes whose sole purpose was to benefit the American firms operating in the region while maintaining the appearance of home rule.
The early years of this model were tumultuous, as the corporations often fought one another for control of each of the banana republics, sometimes even arming rebels on one another's turf in hopes of getting more land and cronies for themselves.
But this is where Wilson played such a major role in codifying this particular form of imperialism.
He used US military intervention to bring corporations and their proxies to the table, to negotiate terms allowing each company roughly equal access wherever a US puppet state was in place.
He laid down the law for the corporate interests on the ground. The US is in charge, and you can either play nice with the other corporations trying to operate there, or you don't get to play at all.
This arrangement has become the dominant geopolitical force in the modern world, though it is nearly invisible in terms of mainstream US politics and media because that's the whole point of such a system.
If the US proclaimed itself to be an empire, used its military to loot the world, and citizens of the US were made aware of this by politicians who openly fought about whose imperial policy was more effective, many Americans would oppose this oppressive system.
And likely even more would demand a share of the profit.
But by obfuscating this system and its importance, anti-imperialists get made to look like tinfoil-hatted conspiracy theorists, and everyone else is left in the dark without a clue about what's actually going on.
Why do we have a crisis at the border? In no small part because we have withdrawn help from people in Central America who are suffering. We need to restore that help. We need to help establish and reestablish the rule of law, so that people don't feel like they have to flee for their lives. We have a crisis that Donald Trump has created.
After the Second World War, Britain and France decolonized and shifted their empires seamlessly into this neo-imperial model at the behest of the US.
The US was adamant that the capitalist world could not continue to be seen as outright imperialists in the face of the USSR, Communist China, and the broader expansion of left-wing anti-imperialist revolutions worldwide.
And in the past couple of years, we've seen this system finally start to crumble for the French in West Africa. The official French imperial state entered into its era of collapse after the Second World War.
Obviously, the Second World War was not a great time for France.
France itself was occupied by the Nazis. Many of its colonies were occupied by the Axis powers, while others were occupied by the Americans and the British to keep the Axis out.
At the end of the war, the French tried to reestablish control within their empire, but they were never really able to.
Two wars really shaped the downfall of outright French imperial rule. They lost an 8-year war in Indochina that started the year after the Second World War had ended, which resulted in the liberation of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos.
And just as that war was ending, they were faced with another 8-year war of independence fought by Algeria, who won and successfully gained their independence in 1962.
By the time that Algerian War for Independence was over, France's empire had basically been dismantled, with only a few small territories being left in their control by the end of 1962. But near the end of that war in Algeria in 1960, most of French West Africa gained its independence, with far less fighting taking place in order for them to do so.
And that's suspicious, right?
The Fourth French Republic had collapsed in 1958 to be replaced by the Fifth Republic, but none of the previous changes in government in France had ever led to the voluntary liberation of colonies.
Even when the French Revolution happened, they weren't intent on letting go of any overseas territories. Liberté, égalité, and fraternité don't apply to Haiti, I guess.
And the 1958 change in government was still 4 years before they eventually gave up the fight to keep Algeria.
There simply was not a change in mindset of the French political leaders about the importance of empire.
The French had learned the hard way in Vietnam what happens when you try to put the boot down on a colony and lose.
Ho Chi Minh and the victorious Vietnamese communists didn't just kick the French imperial regime out. They took back control of all the French-owned assets and resources in the country.
And by the late 1950s, it was getting more and more obvious that the French could not maintain their colonies in Africa by force.
The French aristocrats and corporations who had properties and business interests in these colonies knew that they needed a way to remove the French imperial governments there without allowing for any real self-determination, which would almost certainly result in the loss of all their property.
What they needed was franchises.
And that's exactly what the Fifth French Republic set about giving them.
Guinea was the first to become independent in 1958, followed by Cameroon on January 1st, 1960, and then by the end of that year, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Gabon had all gained their independence as well, among others.
Or more accurately, I guess, by the end of 1960, these nations were all ruled by a local government acting as a franchise operator for the French Empire.
In order to gain independence, these countries were made to sign cooperation agreements with the French.
These agreements cemented the key elements of control that France's business interests demanded.
Property rights were guaranteed for French owners of land, minerals, and other assets in these newly independent nations.
Whatever was stolen by the French under the imperial regime was theirs to keep under these rules. Any kind of reclamation of stolen property by the local population was outlawed.
The French were allowed to keep a military presence on the ground in these new states.
The French continue to keep military bases throughout the region, and there have been over 50 known instances of French military intervention in West Africa since 1960.
And this second element of the agreement guarantees the first.
When leaders have come to power like Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso in 1983, intent on reclaiming land and resources from the French military and intelligence assets on the ground have murdered those leaders like Sankara or banished them, installing French-aligned leaders who would maintain the cooperation agreements.
And the third element of these cooperation agreements was participation in the financial community of Africa and the use of its currency, the CFA franc.
The CFA franc is pegged to the French currency, which was the French franc until 2000 and has been the euro ever since.
Use of the CFA franc requires member countries to keep half of their reserves deposited in France's central bank.
And this is a major issue because when one country has their currency pegged to another country's currency, they lose a lot of their most basic economic tools.
For instance, one way a country might go about trying to make their own exports more competitive in the global market would be to devalue their own currency and make their own exports lower priced in other markets.
But if your currency is pegged to another currency, you can only reduce export prices by reducing the real price of that good in both the local currency and the currency it's pegged to.
This is a huge problem in the other direction as well. Being pegged to a strong foreign currency makes imports appear cheaper than they otherwise might, so domestic producers end up priced out by imported goods.
Staple goods, including crucial staple foods like rice, end up imported from places like Thailand rather than being produced domestically.
Nobody really benefits from this arrangement except for the multinational corporations extracting resources from countries with this type of currency arrangement.
So let's put all of this into one example to show how this cooperation agreement is effectively no different than outright imperialism.
One of Niger's major exports is uranium, and France's extensive nuclear power network is supplied heavily by Nigerian uranium.
Under the terms of Niger's cooperation agreement with France, any uranium mines stolen by French companies prior to Nigerian independence continue to be owned and operated by those French companies. And any discoveries of uranium deposits by French, American, or other multinational firms can be bought by those firms at very low prices thanks to corrupt dealings by the local government.
The labor of Nigerian workers in these mines and processing facilities is also paid in CFA francs for far lower hourly rates than French workers or American workers would be paid for similar labor.
And if anyone tries to get into power in Niger to change any aspects of these arrangements, the French military and intelligence apparatuses are already on the ground in Niger to sabotage movements and kill their leaders.
It is imperialism with the facade of a government that represents the people of Niger, but which actually represents French economic interests.
Let's go back to our last episode where we talked about Gabon and Ali Bongo, who was ousted in a recent coup.
Ali Bongo is the son of Omar Bongo, who ruled Gabon from 1968 until his death in 2009. During the 55 years of absolute rule by the Bongo family, Omar Bongo and his family accumulated an enormous fortune worth billions of dollars.
Gabon is an oil-rich nation and a key member of OPEC. Petroleum exports make up a significant portion of the country's GDP.
French oil companies like Total had been extracting these resources prior to independence and continue to do so to this day.
A quick aside, you should include some kind of financial news in your media diet. Don't bother paying for an expensive subscription-only service like Bloomberg or Grant's Interest Rate Observer or anything crazy like that. Most of CNBC's content is free.
I'm bringing this up now because the day after the coup in Gabon, there was a CNBC article about the coup that couldn't even get 5 words deep without mentioning that Gabon is oil rich.
They don't expect anyone but the vulture class to read their stories, so they're astoundingly honest about what the US and its allies care about in these types of subjects.
Most of the other US coverage in the immediate aftermath of the coup in Gabon was all about the spread of coups in Africa, authoritarianism on the rise, and a bunch of other disingenuous blathering, but CNBC was just yelling the quiet part out loud.
If there's a story in the news, especially if it's happening overseas, and you want to know what the US really cares about, find out what CNBC has to say about it. They'll almost certainly just give the game away.
The Bongo family is the exact profile of the kind of franchisee the French were seeking post-decolonization, and the kind that they continue to want to this day.
They are French educated and well connected to the French ruling class, for one.
They're charismatic and media savvy, able to be one thing to the people of Gabon and another while rubbing elbows with the new global ruling class.
In the grand scheme of things, for companies like Total and the other oil companies extracting wealth from Gabon, the loyalty of the Bongo family and their domestic political allies is bought quite cheaply.
Total Energies, the parent company of Total Oil, made over $36 billion in profits in 2022.
The few billion they and the other multinational firms active in Gabon have kicked down to the Bongos and the other political cronies in Gabon over more than 5 decades is peanuts by comparison.
If the French had clung to power in Gabon, the movement for Gabonese independence would have been a bloody struggle over many years, empowering the most left-wing elements of nationalist movements, and the most likely outcome would have been a fully independent Gabon with a virulently anti-French government coming to power.
All of Total and the other oil companies' assets in the country would have been expropriated. The Bongos were a perfect bulwark against that happening.
It's only been within the last 2 years that French rule has started to implode across West Africa.
Before the coup in Gabon, there had already been coups in Niger, Chad, Guinea, and 2 each in Mali and Burkina Faso, all within the last 2 years.
In each of these coups, a French-aligned government was ousted by factions within the military who are, to varying degrees, becoming uncooperative with the French.
French ambassadors have been told to leave, French embassies and military bases have been vandalized.
And everywhere a French-backed regime has been removed, there has been an outpouring of relief from the local population.
And that's not to say that anyone is super excited about the new military regimes in their own right. Nor does it mean that any of these governments or new elected governments down the line will actually follow through in expelling French, American, and multinational extractors from these countries.
But the people there know that they are being exploited by the French, and they know that the removal of an existing French-backed state would be the first step on any path towards liberation and self-determination.
Thomas Sankara, the former president of Burkina Faso who I mentioned earlier, first came to power in a military coup. He ended up having one of the largest impacts on a country of any post-colonial leader on the continent because he refused to cooperate with the French, the Americans, the World Bank, and the IMF. And the French and their allies murdered him for it.
And there are elements of the military in Burkina Faso who share Sankara's ideological commitments to self-reliance, self-determination, and liberation.
Many people in the Burkinabe military decided to join specifically because they saw what Sankara did and they wanted to do the same.
We cannot guarantee that the new military regimes that have come to power will be guided by such principles, or any principles for that matter, but we should not fall prey to the US State Department and media's assertions that these countries are moving in inherently authoritarian directions.
Watch carefully how such lines are drawn in coverage of these coups in the US media.
In most cases, when talking about the new military governments, US media outlets are quick to frame the transition to civilian-led governments as being a return to civilian rule.
Return.
We can see that in this NPR article regarding the coup in Gabon and the timeline for elections to be scheduled there by the military regime.
Elections in Gabon in the future would not be a return to civilian rule because the Bongo era was not civilian rule either.
It was one family rule with the full enforcement of the military plus American and French military backing.
Future Gabonese elections would either be a return to a Bongo-style puppet state, or they would be the first elections that allow for civilian rule and self-determination in the history of Gabon.
Like I said last week, this is a specific type of transitional placement in the hot seat.
The countries that have had their French-backed governments removed have not yet crossed any line that would put them in the hot seat on a permanent basis.
But France and the US still don't know whether or not they're going to get compliance with those old cooperation agreements that the French forced on these countries.
And all of this is very much what the early developers of the neo-imperial model had in mind for how these types of franchises would operate.
There's an inherent instability to these kinds of franchise regimes because they're meant to create the false impression of home rule and self-determination. So when people living in these places get fed up with the government, they expect to be able to change that government.
When the old regime starts to wobble, the first thing the empire tends to do is try and head off any popular uprising with a military coup of their own, using affiliates that they keep on the payroll inside of the military.
This is the case we saw last week when we talked about Egypt. Mubarak had been the dictator, he became so unpopular that he had to resign, they had elections, Morsi was elected, Morsi got hot-seated, and then Morsi got couped by a US-aligned general, al-Sisi.
But as we saw in that example, the State Department and the media get very quiet very quickly when they know that they're getting the outcome that they wanted.
In the cases in West Africa, we're still not seeing that kind of settling occurring, so we can presume that there's still more that the empire expects before they will quiet down about Gabon, Niger, Guinea, Mali, and Burkina Faso.
And in the cases of Gabon and Niger especially, their massive reserves of oil and uranium respectively make them crucial colonies for the French, and for the Anglo-Franco-American Empire at large.
Keep an eye on these stories as they develop.
Watch for major swings in US media coverage, especially if stories start to become more frequent or more hostile. But also pay attention for if they fall off the grid completely.
We'll be back soon with another episode.
I really want to talk about refugees from Central America on this show and put the political and economic catastrophes in Central America in some context. We kind of already started doing that today, but we barely scraped the surface.
And I've also got some theories about the civil war in Sudan that's happening right now, which I'd like to get to soon as well.
Plus, this is a big empire, and who knows what else will happen before the next episode that'll require our attention.
Y'all send me any stories you'd like to hear about on this show as well.
I've been Connor Buchanan, and thanks for watching, y'all. We'll see you next time.
This has been a presentation of New LJ Television. Visit us online at newlj.tv from the library of the LJ Makerspace. Brought to you by New LJ TV, online at newlj.tv.